The theme of the conference is this idea of, can we talk about Jesus? And that's a very Ignatian question. And Ignatius wanted to talk about Jesus with everybody he met in every circumstance, all kinds of different people. And so I think it's helpful to look at several moments in Ignatius's life when he begins to focus sharply on the person of Jesus. So the first point that we were looking at this morning was this idea of Ignatius being called by Christ the King. The idea that Christ has a particular message for Ignatius, and Ignatius responds to that call of Jesus. He really has two meditations in the spiritual exercises. One of them is this idea of choosing between the standard or the flag of the bad king, of the devil, and choosing the good flag of Christ. And that's a fairly straightforward choice. We don't choose the bad, we choose the good. But then Ignatius has another meditation called the Call of the King. And in that meditation, he's saying, imagine an earthly king who is well respected by people, and then how people will follow that king. And then he says, imagine being called by Christ the King. So you have two goods. You have this good king, and you have Christ the King. And what we try and do is to follow the better, the magis. And so for Ignatius, that interaction with Jesus, that knowing Jesus personally, becomes very, very important. It's not about a general spirituality. It's not talking about God. It's talking about Jesus, the person. But we're not ashamed of Jesus. We say, we come from this Christian tradition. Here is why we are here. We are doing education. We are running this school because we are Christians. That doesn't mean everybody in the school needs to be a Christian. So for Ignatius, people called Ignatius and his first companions Ignatians, and Ignatius was very angry with that and didn't want that. For him, it was about each individual's relationship with Jesus. And so when he came to name the society, what he wanted it to be called was the Society or the Company of Jesus, not the Company of Ignatius. Each person develops that personal relationship with Christ. Each person is called individually by Christ. And it's in virtue of that call that they then become a society or a company of Jesus. Jesus doesn't weaponize himself. It's always a proposal. And some people would say, well, no, thank you very much. I don't want that proposal. But we keep coming back. It's like St. Ignatius with St. Francis Xavier. Ignatius just kept dropping in, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and to lose his soul? And eventually, Francis Xavier caves in, gives in, and is converted. So it's in a very gentle way just to remain faithful to these young people. Why? Because they're God's creations. They're worth being faithful to. However they respond, whatever they think, whatever their families are saying, it's worth being faithful to them. And then let God do the work. Because that's the other thing. We're always tempted to think it's all us and what we achieve, and it's not. It's God's work. We do the best we can. We provide a certain context. We propose certain values. But at the end of the day, it's God's work. And God may choose very different outcomes from the ones that we choose. Ignatius, when he was deciding that in his life he would follow Christ, that would be his priority. He was trying to work out how you do that, and his idea was that in order to be a good Christian, you emulated the saints, you did what the saints did. And for him, he wanted to go further than that, and he wanted to be a disciple as close to Christ as he could. So his idea was to go to Jerusalem and live in Jerusalem, in the towns and the villages and the fields where Jesus walked, where Jesus taught, where Jesus did his miracles. And in that way, he would be very close to Christ. But he quickly found that didn't really work. He became obsessed with this idea of going to Jerusalem and living like a disciple. But of course, Jesus had lived 1,500 years earlier, so he couldn't do that. So when he comes back to Rome, he then thinks of things in a different way, and it's this following Christ wherever he is and serving Christ in whatever way he can. And then his companions pick up on that idea, and they become a group that do that. So they are modern disciples of Christ, but wherever they find the greatest needs. Mm-hmm. Yes, so the experience at La Storta, this little church outside Rome, about a mile outside Rome, the companions are heading towards Rome. They haven't been able to go to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land. For Ignatius, he hasn't been able to return to the Holy Land. So they go to Rome seeking to put themselves at the disposal of the Pope. Ignatius uses this title for the Pope, the Vicar of Christ. So for Ignatius, the Pope is the person of Jesus, or the voice of Jesus in the modern age. So they go to Rome, but just outside he stops and he has this deep experience, this vision where he sees God the Father placing him with his son Jesus. So he interprets this as God saying that he will be with him and be on his side in the various things that are going to happen in Rome. In his spiritual exercises, Ignatius has many exercises where the idea is to imagine yourself into a scene in the life of Christ. And by imagining yourself, you use your senses, so you see what there is to see, you hear what's being said, you experience the scene in an imaginative way. And in that way, he feels that Christ comes alive and one can engage with Christ, with Jesus. And in that way, you move from simply an external knowledge of what happened and what Jesus said to a much more personal engagement. And then in that, you hear Christ calling you to whatever he's asking you to do. So for Ignatius, that imaginative contemplation is very characteristic of his way of praying and his way of meditating. I think there is a danger that we can very easily talk about God, and we can very easily talk about spirituality, and it becomes diffuse and unclear. Whereas if you focus on the person of Jesus, in the Christian tradition, Jesus is the face of God. Jesus is the icon of God. And so by focusing on Jesus, you see the way God is for humans. And I think Ignatius understood that very clearly. And so he would say, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. Jesus will tell you the kind of being that God is. So for Ignatius, that developing that intimate knowledge of Jesus and that engagement at a personal level with Jesus becomes very, very important for who you are as a Christian and who you are as a human being as well. For Christians, Jesus is saying something about what it means to be a good human being and to lead a good human life. And I think when you start looking at the values that Jesus teaches, you see that applies to all human beings. It's not about a particular religion or a particular group of people. It's about being a good human being. So when you look at religions at their best tap into something very deep and shared in humanity. And religions at their worst are exclusive and divisive. And I think once you start looking at what Jesus teaches, you see it's fundamental things about compassion, about love, about forgiveness, about hope, about joy. It's things like that which all human beings share. We may articulate it in different ways, but it's fundamental to what we are as human beings. It becomes much more focused, and we begin to get the balance right between what is explicitly Ignatian, what is explicitly Christian, and what is explicitly Catholic. And I think perhaps one of the most important things to remember is that if you begin to articulate the gospel values, and the gospel values seen through our Jesuit tradition, what you find yourself doing is articulating deeply human values that are shared. So again, in our schools, we've tried to develop a very clear articulation of Christian values, but they're values that come from our tradition, but are very much shared with everybody. And once you start doing that, I think it works well. And there's a lot of divisive religion where people are using religion in order to divide people and judge people. And I think Christ's message is never divisive and it's never judgmental. So that's what we have to hang on to in the Jesuit schools.
Do you think that it's possible?
I do. I mean, I think you have to get enough of the adults in the community, the teachers and the support staff, understanding what Christ's message is and what we're trying to do with it in the school. We're not trying to sell a religion. We're not trying to convert people or persuade them that way. What we're trying to do is to say, here in Jesus Christ is somebody who has a profound insight into what it means to be human. And by listening to him and taking on Jesus' values, that improves us as human beings. A good example would be in our school in Scotland. The deputy head there, Isabel, was talking to some Protestant parents. It is very unusual in Glasgow for Protestant families to come to our Catholic school in that part of Britain. And the Protestant family were concerned. They were saying, we don't know much about Catholicism. You know, is our daughter going to be taught strange things? What is going to happen? And the deputy head there had our words, our pupil profile. And she simply said, those are our values. Is there anything there that you do not want? And this parent looked at this and said, that's exactly what we want for our daughter. Because there was nothing there that was alien to being a good human being. So it's about articulating what good human beings look like, but also acknowledging our tradition. I think people don't respect us if we abandon our Ignatian, Jesuit, Catholic tradition. That's where we come from. And we are offering something and bringing something to that. So it's something like that. The heads of the schools need to be confident that they can articulate Jesus' message, and that they can propose that to the students in their schools and the staff in their schools as well. And if they do that well, then we're speaking up for really important values in society, especially when many others are talking about divisive things and judgmental things. What do you do as a school to put Jesus in the way of people, students or staff? During the course of the day, do students bump into Jesus? And you can do it, of course, in various ways. You can do it through iconography. If you put up images, then the images raise questions. Think about good images to use around the school. Some schools I came across recently in Ireland had the practice of getting the students to copy out a small passage of the gospel. This is in primary schools. And they had this book of the gospel in the entrance to the school with a candle. And everybody could see as they entered the school, there is the little piece of the gospel for today, but written in the hand of one of the students. Well, JECSE is part of the much wider network of Jesuit schools worldwide. And I think if we are networking well and sharing resources and sharing ideas and then presenting what Jesuit education is about, then if we do that well, then there's a chance that the message of Jesus and the person of Jesus gets known well and gets shared and can do something good for society. I think we also need to be careful that when we talk about Ignatius and Ignatian spirituality in Jesuit schools, that doesn't become the focus and the end point. Ignatius and the spiritual exercises always point to Jesus. They're always taking us towards Jesus Christ. And there's a danger that we stop with Ignatius and talk about Ignatius all the time. And so we need to make sure that Ignatius is the path and the method, but not the end point. The end point is getting to know Jesus Christ so that we may know him, we may love him, and then we can serve him through the children in the schools.